Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Asia Society Korea webinar. My name is Mason Richey. I'm a senior contributor here with Asia Society Korea, and we are happy to welcome everyone who is here to watch this webinar on South Korea's foreign policy. We've entitled it Making Haste Slowly: Is South Korea's Foreign and Security Policy Patient or Complacent? And to take a look at the foreign and security policy of South Korea, both through the first roughly 7 to 8 months of the Yoon Suk-Yeol administration in 2022, and looking forward to what we can perhaps expect in 2023. We're joined by two outstanding experts today. In the first place, we are joined by Kim Jeongmin, who is the chief correspondent for NK News. She is extremely experienced, as a journalist, as an expert, as an analyst, both in North Korea-related issues, obviously, given the outfit for which she works, and also with South Korea as well. She covers international and DPRK-related foreign defense and humanitarian affairs. She's covered the 2022 South Korean election on the ground. She's extremely experienced at NK News and the North Korea Risk Group. And prior to there, she, of course, gained experience at CSIS, working for the Korea chair in Washington, D.C. So obviously we have a wealth of experience there. I'm not sure if I should say this, but she also just returned from Washington, D.C. and New York. So there might be a little bit of insight that she can provide us today on some of the things that she might have learned there. Obviously, we won't ask her to divulge anything that was said under Chatham House rules, of course, but anything that you might be able to add. The discussion coming from Washington and New York would, of course, be valuable. And then in the second place, we are joined by Ambassador Oh, who is also a board member of Asia Society Korea. He has joined, I believe, roughly within the last year, and has made an outstanding contribution so far, both as a board member and as an expert in a number of events, including a previous webinar that I hosted. And Ambassador Oh is peculiarly fitted for this particular topic today, which looks, of course, at South Korea's foreign policy in a global context, insofar as he is a professor of United Nations Studies at Kyunghee University in Seoul, South Korea. We were both just going over the fact that it's our last week of the semester, and both he and I are drowning or soon to be drowning under student work coming in and all of the grades we have to do. And of course, he was ambassador and permanent representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations in New York from 2013 to 2016. He was, as a part of that mandate, the 71st president of the Economic and Social Council, and also president of the Conference of the States to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2015 and 2016. He also has a wealth of experience in other ambassadorial positions, notably in Singapore, and was also the Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2008 to 2010. So we have both a lot of journalistic experience and a lot of practical experience in the field, and we're obviously honored to have both Jeongmin and Ambassador Oh join us today. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and launch right into, I guess, my first question that sort of runs through my head. I'm sort of looking at this event today as a kind of year-ender plus a look forward to 2023. And so I guess I would start by asking, after the first calendar year, basically the first 7 or 8 months since the inauguration of President Yoon Suk-Yeol, how would you assess the security and foreign policy situation of South Korea? Perhaps we'll start with Ambassador Oh.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you for having me on this Asia Society Korea webinar again. I think, as for your question, I think it has not been long enough to assess something like the effect of foreign policy, which usually take more time to show. So I think in a way we cannot but compare the policies of the Yoon government with those of the previous government, I think a dominant concern, for example, for President Moon's foreign and security policy was how to improve ties with North Korea and maintain peace on the Korean peninsula. Well, North Korea was also a key concern for South Korean government in the past, especially for those during the Cold War years, but in a different context, because they were mostly concerned about how to fight and overcome North Korea. Either way, I think too much emphasis on North Korea by now can distort, has the risk of distorting South Korea's foreign policy priorities, not least considering that South Korea is now, its global role has grown dramatically over the years. The Yoon government is saying that they are fixing that problem and taking more balanced approach towards North Korea, but we will have to see if they can avoid kind of overshooting.
Great, thanks. So I made two notes as you were speaking, and the first one I think goes to to some degree to the title of the program. When we were coming up with this brainstorming, we came up with this idea of a Latin phrase I really love, festina lant, right? To make haste slowly. And so that sort of made its way into the title, making haste slowly. So, to some degree, we asked the second half of the question, is South Korea's foreign policy under Yoon, is it patient, making progress slowly but surely, or is it complacent? Is it not moving quickly enough in the directions that are necessary to, improve and advance the national interest? And I think your answer begins to hint at one way of thinking about that, which is to say, to some degree, it's perhaps too early, which I guess would side us towards the patient version of things. Not only should the administration be patient in the execution of its foreign and security policy, but also our judgment of it should also be patient. I think that's absolutely a fair point. The second thing that you got to was you mentioned the word global, and I'm not going to go there quite yet, but we all know that the Yoon administration, especially under the influence of Foreign Minister Park Jin, has put quite a bit of emphasis on developing South Korea into what it refers to as a global pivotal state, the GPS concept, which will come back up again. And so you, in some sense, have begun to reference that as well. But I'll stop talking here and essentially ask the same question to Jeongmin. How do you assess the foreign and security policy situation of South Korea at present, after the first 7 months of the Yoon administration?
Thank you, Mason. Also, thank you for your very generous introduction of me. I'm very honored to be here with you and Ambassador Oh. To your first question and about the title, complacent or patient, I think for the past few months since inauguration, I think the goal for South Korea was to neither complacent or patient, but avoiding the worst. I think there were a lot of challenges already there that South Korea, the Yoon administration was basically walking into. The increased competition between US and China, especially on the supply chain front, Russia-Ukraine war, and North Korea a few months into Yoon administration, passing the new nuclear doctrine law, increased talk about tactical nuclear weapons, the estranged ROK Japan ties. There were a lot of very difficult diplomatic tasks that the Yoon administration had to handle. And also there were a lot of opportunities where it could very easily turn into disaster if not handled well, like the multilateral diplomacy scene, which Ambassador Oh can probably explain more about, such as the NATO conference and just a lot of summit diplomacy after Yoon inauguration this year. And with this backdrop of a lot of just global tension increasing, I think South Korea had no choice but to face a lot of very new security dilemma. But just all in all, like Ambassador O said, I think it's too early to assess. But so far, it seems like Yoon administration, in order to avoid the worst, they were taking sort of like a middle ground route, not being too extreme, treading too close to one country. Aside from the US, increasing the US-ROK alliance seems to have been the top priority for South Korea. So I think, although there were a lot of potential trigger points for the worst, I think for the past few months, it seems like Seoul avoided the worst potential scenarios of escalation, but definitely there's a lot of challenge ahead for the next year.
Okay, so there's a lot obviously to unpack there. And, to some degree, I guess we could just stop talking now and send everyone off to go read about all of the issues that you just mentioned. But I don't think that we should do that. So I think if I had to sort of summarize a little bit sort of where I think we can go based off of your first set of comments. It seems to me that the biggest, there are two challenges, let's say, that South Korea faces. The immediate and obvious one is North Korea. And this is, of course, been the case for decades, essentially since 1950 or even earlier. But of course, the dynamic has changed because of North Korea's much more capable nuclear and missile program, which puts in turn not only conventional deterrent stress on South Korea and the US-ROK alliance, but also more noticeably stress on extended nuclear deterrence, which calls for extensive reassurance by the United States and increasing consultation between the U.S. and South Korea on how the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence can be supported. I will come back to that in detail, but that's, I think, the first risk, or the first challenge. And then you have the second challenge, and that's the more comprehensive, long-term, and in some sense, like intractable problem of South Korea being so close to China geographically, so dependent on China in terms of trade and economics, and yet its primary security partner and guarantor being Washington, D.C., which finds itself in this great power competition with China. And so the stresses that puts on the foreign and security policy front are clearly a challenge, which you reference. Within that sort of context, what do you think are the biggest foreign and security risks that South Korea faces? And it doesn't have to be necessarily with reference only to those two sort of bookends, let's say, of challenges. You can talk about those in more detail, but if you want to add some other things to that, some other complicating factors, that's fine. And then the other risk, the other thing is to ask about the opportunities, because you mentioned some of those as well. So I guess let's start with Ambassador O. Where do you find the biggest risks in the foreign and security policy situation of South Korea? And where are the opportunities? Where has the administration been laying the groundwork for some of those opportunities to cash out later? And also, what opportunistically in 2023, do you think South Korea can legitimately look forward to as places where it can advance its national interests through its foreign and security policy?
Well, in the past, as you have just pointed out, risks for South Korea's foreign and security policies mostly came from threats by North Korea. But I think nowadays, even if North Korea does not do anything dangerous next year, I think South Korea will still have to deal with all the challenges of our times. There are so many international risks waiting for us in 2023, not just for South Korea, but for any other countries in the world. including the war in Ukraine, global economic recessions, public health crises, and the US-China confrontation, to name a few. So South Korea is not South Korea 20 years ago. By now, I think the country has to be part of the international efforts to cope with these challenges. On the other hand, you also talked about opportunities. I think opportunities seem to be limited, but we might be able to take comforts in the fact that our economic predicaments after the COVID-19 crisis are probably not as bad as some other countries, for example, European countries. And another opportunity might be, South Korea's rising soft power, in particular in cultural soft power, that seems to be on the right track. So there might be an advantage for South Korea next year as well.
I want to pick up on that very last point you made, just make a brief comment, and then I'll go back to Jeongmin. When I was I was at some event a few months ago when it was still warm enough to go outside and have these garden party kind of events or whatever at one of the ambassadors' residences here. And I was talking with some of the ambassadors in a small gaggle, and I don't remember who, but one of them mentioned that the quality of ambassadors here has increased enormously. And I've been here for something like 13 years, and without calling out names, there were a lot of states that clearly 13 years ago weren't sending their best. They were maybe sending people who were inexperienced. They were perhaps sending people who didn't have good political connections back home. They were sometimes sending people who it was their last stop and before they went into retirement, and it was a sort of quasi pre-retirement post. And the last 7 or 8 years, I've really seen personally a real increase in the capability, the interest level, the competence, the organizational ability to bring lots of throughput from people from their ministries of foreign affairs and the various delegations coming in among the ambassadors here. And that's not only because of the rise of Samsung or SK or these other businesses. As the ambassadors told me, they said part of it is mind share, and it's come out of the Hallyu movement that essentially Korea has moved its place up the list quite significantly, simply by virtue of the fact that populations overseas, especially in places like Europe and Southeast Asia, they now look at South Korea, much more significantly in the popular culture space, which ends up, in democracies at least, cashing out in terms of greater attention being paid to it diplomatically. So I think that's an excellent point you make in terms of opportunities. At the risk side, unfortunately, I look at the things that you just listed, and we hadn't even had a chance to talk about, obviously, the issue with Ukraine and the war there. That's a traditional security risk that threatens the international order, not just in a specific way, but generally as well. You've got the global public health crisis that's come through COVID. You talked about climate change, so you've got non-traditional security issues. You've got traditional security issues. Geopolitics obviously playing a role. So there are a lot of risks there. So I think that's a point well taken. Jeongmin, you referenced this earlier. Yoon came into office pledging to improve the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Do you think that he and his team have succeeded, both in the foreign policy and on the security and defense policy side of it? What are the strengths of the alliances? What are the weaknesses of the alliance after the first 7 months of Yoon?
I think the answer to this question will also relate to the question that was just asked to Ambassador Oh about the foreign and security risks and opportunities. I think a lot of them depends on the US-ROK relation. direct answer to whether they succeeded in improving alliance, yes, I think so. The US-ROK drills, field exercises resumed in years that were suspended or scaled down, or even canceled during the previous administration. So in terms of general US-ROK combined readiness, I think it's definitely improving. Also, when it comes to economic security issues, which these days we consider into the security risks and opportunities, I think there's more space to improve in the future, but I think it was a good starting point to discuss IPEF and Chip 4. And this actually comes with a risk that you asked in the previous question because of China. The supply chain issue in the coming years will become it will face increasing tension with South Korea have already been part of China's China-led regional economic forum, and South Korea also joining IPEF and talking about Chip 4. South Korea is sort of stuck in between, trying to balance out the two. But at some point, there will come a trigger point where South Korea has to make a decision, I think, but it hasn't come yet. So also, like things like IPEF, it's still on a very general, vague term rather than going into detail. So I think that's why China is less provoked. So, but at one point, South Korea will have to make a decision, and that will be a very tough one. Also, when it comes to deterrence capabilities, I think this is a gray area for now. I think starting in May when there was a summit and President Biden vowing for a full capability of deterrence, to protect South Korea, I think on the rhetorical level, good. And there were some selfies taken in front of B-1B bombers, and there were strategic assets being deployed for drills like Vigilant Storm B-1B. And the U.S. side also pledged a constant-based deployment of strategic assets after North Korea did the tactical nuclear weapons unit drill and also the new nuclear doctrine, which basically lowered the conditions of use for nuclear weapons and even a preemptive strike against non-nuclear states that are allied to a nuclear state, which basically means, or including South Korea or even Japan. So I think with this backdrop, South Korea will and is already facing increased discussion at the National Assembly, just Yeouido in general, where even the conservative lawmakers are very pro-US, are now openly discussing arming South Korea with nuclear weapons, either redeploying or having more access to US nuclear weapons. I think US and South Korea recently met a good middle ground with a constant base, but I don't think it has persuaded all of the lawmakers at the National Assembly. So that's, I think, space to watch. And I think that's the weakness that potential weakness that we are seeing. Like you mentioned, the ongoing, some sort of, known but unsaid, doubt against the credibility of the US extended deterrence.
If I can stay with you for just a second, Jeongmin. So, two things, I guess. First, as I mentioned in the introduction, you just got back from New York and Washington. Any special insight that you might have gotten there that you can share with us about, where the alliance is on the priority list, what from the U.S. side might be opportunities going forward, but also concerns or worries. You've now, brought up, extended nuclear deterrence again. And of course, that's with reference, primarily to North Korea. So maybe if you want to offer a little bit on where the U.S. is on North Korea and how that comports with where the Yoon administration is on North Korea. Maybe if there's anything you can bring us back from Washington to New York. And then, that's looking, to some degree more in the North Korea related, optic, but, to go back also to the other thing, which both of you have mentioned is very important. That's the economic security dimension of things. Anything that you're, capable of telling us that you might have learned on your trip with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the stress that has caused between the U.S. and South Korea. And for those of you who are watching this and aren't aware of what that is, the U.S. passed a law earlier this year that gives preferential subsidies to electric vehicle battery manufacturers if they carry out the manufacturing in the United States, and overseas car manufacturing companies, like Hyundai here in Korea, but also Japanese car companies, European car companies are extremely unhappy about this preferential subsidy, which they find to not only be a sort of slap in the face to allies, but also to undermine World Trade Organization trade principles. So that's sort of the context for my question. So Jeongmin, if you want to weigh in on those things a little bit, and then we'll come back to Ambassador Oh. I have some questions to come back to you as well.
Okay, that's a very packed packed question. I think I can answer primarily on the military side of things. That my trip to DC and New York was mainly about North Korea. So apparently a lot of concerns about security, hard security, like military, potential accidental clashes. First of all, although most of the meetings and events that we had were about North Korea, there were actually serious concerns about the increasing discussion of tactical nuclear weapons, possession among South Korean elites. And this all boils down to what kind of signaling that United States is making when it comes to extended deterrence. But it seemed like in Washington, the general ambiance is they understand why South Korea might be feeling that way, but there will be ways to figure it out without stepping outside the line of the of South Korea breaking the non-proliferation treaty, which is a big no-no, especially for Washington and also for many South Korean political leaders as well. I think it wasn't in your question, but another part about South Korea's role in the global field right now, I think it's also about what kind of role that South Korea plays in terms of the rule-based order protecting the democratic values. There are a lot of, China is becoming more and more authoritarian, and Russia basically threatening of nuclear usage and doing an unprompted aggression against Ukraine. But what's South Korea doing? What South Korea doing enough is if South Korea cannot aid military assets, weapons to Ukraine, what kind of signaling can South Korea do standing basically supporting Ukraine, and also very sensitive issues like Taiwan and Xinjiang against China? It seems like in that space, South Korea could not and did not make much progress, but understandable, I think. Also, I think another concern that I also shared a lot is potential accidental clash near the border. There were a lot of questions about how to interpret recent North Korean military activities in the past 8 or 10 weeks. A lot of missiles, record high missiles actually, and just downright breaking the Inter-Korean Agreement, CMA 2018 agreement, by shooting artillery shells into Inter-Korean buffer zone on daily basis. What do we make of this? It seems like aside from what do we make of this, how do we handle the situation? How do we manage risks? I think there were concerns about South Korea being a little bit too hot-headed with the responses, a lot of hostile rhetorics going back and forth, the drills being also South Korean unilateral responses being very much promoted on the public side. With the frequency increasing, it seemed like there were increasing concerns on potential accidental or miscalculated clashes happening to the level of what we saw in 2012, Cheonan, Yeonpyeong, sort of regional provocation. So I think that concern is pretty real. And it seems Washington is keeping a close eye on how Seoul is preparing to manage that kind of worst case scenarios potentially happening in the next few years.
Yeah, just anecdotally with respect to that last point, I personally know of like 4 or 5, essentially corporate risk consultants who have been coming into Korea, over the last 6 weeks or so, basically to go into large multinational corporations and give briefings to their executive staff here, notably the overseas executive staff, the expatriates, on what to do if something goes wrong. If there is an escalation that takes place, like how do you get your people out?
Exactly.
How
do you get to the airport?
Yeah, how do
Where
you
do you hide?
Yeah, exactly. How do you get people across the bridges to the south side? Like, how do you get them to the airport? And obviously that's all, worst case scenario planning. And that's not the only thing they did. They were also there to get briefings themselves about, what the situation is here. But the origin of the concern from the risk consultants seemed actually to be more about South Korean responses to North Korean provocations rather than North Korean provocations themselves. So I think that's an interesting point that you make there. So if I can, I've sort of interpreted the Yoon administration in terms of its emphasis on foreign security policy as essentially aiming to improve the foundation of the ability of South Korea to engage in bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral diplomacy by solidifying the relationship with the U.S. And then using that as a springboard or a solid foundation to be able to make forays into other areas, whether they be bilateral or otherwise. So I think we've addressed, somewhat the U.S.-South Korea alliance question. We've done that by touching a bit on North Korea and a bit on China as well. So, but maybe to go a little bit deeper there and start looking at some of those relationships that South Korea has. I think I'll start with you, Ambassador Yoon. How do you think President Yoon so far has managed the relationship with China? And what do you think so far has been what is your assessment so far of the development of the South Korea-China relationship under Yoon?
Well, the Yoon government so far has been successful, if you like, to a certain extent in strengthening the alliance with the United States. Actually, mostly just by restoring what the two allies had been doing before the Moon government, because the weakening of the alliance was part of kind of collateral damage brought by President Moon's priority on reconciliation with North Korea. Well, reconciliation with North Korea has nothing wrong, but if you are too much occupied by it and you ask yourself a question like, what about North Korea in dealing with whatever foreign and security policy, then you necessarily have some bias. So the Yoon government is saying that they are fixing the bias, but they also have the risk of overshooting, as I said. And, if you ask yourself a question, what about North Korea in dealing with whatever foreign and security policy, the other way around, like South Korean government did 40 years ago when I started out as a diplomat, they were devoted to bashing the Kim Jong-un, that time Kim Il-sung regime, and, devoted to overcoming North Korea, winning over North Korea, whatever they are doing, then you are also biased. So that's they have that kind of risk. I'm not saying that the Yoon government is overshooting already, but they have to be careful about it. As philosopher Nietzsche said, when you are fighting a monster, make sure that you don't become a monster. So if you apply that to China, I think the President Yoon's strengthening of the alliance with the United States necessarily invites pushbacks from North Korea and China. You cannot avoid it. President Yoon said that his government would take a more principled position vis-a-vis the United States and China, vis-a-vis China, I mean. United States and China, I think, because some people think we have to be balancing between those two. But this is probably easier said than done, as China is a critically important trade partner for South Korea. President Yoon cannot just shrug off this dilemma. In fact, I think South Korea doesn't have much of leverage in dealing with China, probably other than substantial economic interdependence. So far, not much has happened between the two governments. I think in a way they are still testing water or waiting for the other side to make a move. But sooner or later, I think the Yoon government will probably have to make a kind of friendly gesture to Beijing to break the ice. This is, of course, unless there is a rise of tension between China and the United States, for example, over Taiwan.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, one of the risks that everyone's concerned about in some form or another is Taiwan. I get the impression that, interestingly, to some degree, that the China challenge has been the dog that hasn't barked yet. I think a lot of people thought maybe China would be more aggressive in its foreign policy outlook vis-a-vis South Korea after Yoon came in. Both to some degree kind of bullying a smaller neighbor, but also because of the policy of on Seoul's part of improving the alliance with the U.S. and that this might irritate China. Although I guess the explanation is now shifted into COVID problems in China plus the Xi Jinping Party Congress in October sort of put a break on China's ability to be more aggressive with South Korea. So I guess we'll see whether or not that changes going forward. Jeongmin, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just briefly on China, I just wanted to include also a domestic dimension into this. For decades, South Korea's most hated outside country was either North Korea or Japan. But I think that has been changing for the past few years. And Yoon administration, they came into office with a very low approval rate, started off as a very unpopular president. In 2024, National Assembly election is coming up, and it seems like the president is a little bit still in the election mode, if you look at his statements. And hence, considering the diplomatic policy, international relations policy, I think it also cannot but relate to what kind of sentiments that South Korean public, the constituency, has against other countries. So for Yoon, it will be very difficult to become too friendly with China, because the constituents really, really hate China right now. The anti-China sentiment is just increasing very rapidly for the past few years. And at the same time, which is a good opportunity for Yoon because people has become much more indifferent towards Japanese neighbors. So it's both risk and opportunity for Yoon, it seems.
Well, it's great that you brought up Tokyo because they were next on my list. Yeah, that's actually my very next question. The Yoon administration has prioritized, improved relations with Tokyo, at least rhetorically. But it seems to my eyes, and I actually have just come back from Japan, it seems to me that this is moving more slowly than perhaps Seoul would have wanted. It also seems like it's moving somewhat more slowly than Washington, I think, would want. Despite, I think, efforts by the Yoon foreign policy team to move this forward. Ambassador, what do you think are the realistic prospects for improved Seoul-Tokyo relations over the next year, let's say?
Well, it's not easy, of course. And I think the Yoon government understands that bilateral issues, most of which have historical backgrounds, are very difficult to make progress on. And as such, in a way, keeping these issues on the back burner is probably about what they can do about them right now. But one big difference from the Moon government is that, they are clearly willing to engage Japan in cooperation with the United States to deal with North Korea, to cope with threats from North Korea, including by strengthening military cooperation in the context of a three-way alliance, sort of, not exactly alliance, but three-way military cooperation. That also can become very controversial in South Korea, as you know. But I think it seems to me that the Yoon government has decided to bite the bullet when it comes to security cooperation, whereas they will probably be more cautious about approaching historical issues.
Jeongmin, what's your take on Japan?
Well, firstly, I think all in all, it was a good choice from the Yoon administration to start with focusing on improving trilateral relations, which I think what Washington has wanted for the past 5 years, especially when we think about sorry, I keep talking about North Korea because that's my beat, but North Korean new missile capabilities, it cannot be fully monitored by just one country. It needs radars from different locations. And I think increased sharing of missile launch data, just increased trilateral drills. I think these were a good, also smart, because if you see the past few months of the rhetoric that the Democratic Party, the opposition party, has been pushing for, accusing the Yoon administration of pro-Japan, of for trilateral drills, it didn't really fly well in South Korea. So although Japan issue is a very sensitive issue, I think it's good to start with the trilateral improvement. But when it comes to bilateral, not only that there's difficulty that we have mentioned so far, I think another factor is the vibe in Japan. I think if the Japanese cabinet, if the Japanese political elites are not that willing to improve the relations that rapidly as Yoon administration wants, Seoul won't have much choice but to basically wait until the environment gets better in Japan for them to speed up a little bit on improving relations.
Totally a fair point. So the bilateral relations there, yeah, they definitely seem like they're tougher than in some ways, or more limited because of so much baggage, as opposed to the trilateral mechanisms. The interesting point, I think, it kind of relates back to the discussion about China and managing the China relationship. This sort of boomerangs back from the trilateral, Seoul-Tokyo, Washington cooperation in the military realm, notably in the area of missile defense, for instance. Is that this is something that China really doesn't want to see, right? And so China is very unenthusiastic about this trilateral cooperation. It formed one of the, or in several, I think at least two of the three no's in the three no's policy that China sort of essentially demanded from the Moon administration after the placing of the THAAD system here in South Korea. So there's a connection there. And I wanted to use that connection with China to actually go back briefly, so looking forward to 2023, and to go back to Ambassador Oh and ask a question about, again, South Korea-China relations. Do you envision a visit of Xi to South Korea or a visit of Yoon to China in 2023? Do you think that a summit is in the cards, or do you think that's too ambitious for next year?
Well, theoretically, that's possible. But as I said, I think one of them has to break the ice. And I think it's going to be probably South Korea. And I don't know how they can, try to arrange a summit level visits, unless they can kind of have common understanding about how much ground they can give each other in terms of China's wish to make clear about parameters of United States influence in this part of the world and the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan, and also in terms of South Korea's need to restore alliance with the United States. So they have to meet in the middle and they have to find common ground. And then if that's possible, then they can have summit level visits, I guess.
Okay, so that's not a yes or a no answer, which is what I was hoping for. I was hoping to get.
No, it's not easy.
I was hoping to get a prediction. Yes or no. Fair enough. That's a totally fair answer. We're starting to run out of time, so I want to just hit a few last things. Yoon came into office promising to make South Korea this quote unquote global pivotal state. This was articulated, in a Yoon foreign policy team piece authored by his foreign policy team and by himself in an article in Foreign Affairs. And the idea there is to move away from disproportional focus on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. So we're 7 months in. How is that project going? I would ask both of you that question. Maybe you wanted to even give them a grade, A for, excellent and an F for a total failure. And I guess as a sort of sideline to that question, if I can think of some sort of metrics for how we could evaluate that, I would say, how would you evaluate Yoon's policy vis-a-vis Europe, Southeast Asia? What can we expect from the upcoming, long-promised Indo-Pacific strategy that South Korea is going to put out later this month, supposedly? And also, and this is especially for you, Ambassador Yoon, being on the front foot in multilateralism and with respect to the United Nations. So sort of looking at all of those like ways or metrics of thinking about South Korea as a global pivotal state, how would you assess the first 7 months of this, and what do you expect going forward? Ambassador Oh, let's start with you.
But if I'm grading Yoon's foreign policy only on the basis of multilateral policies like global pivotal states, then I would give them A minus. But I said there is this condition that if I'm talking about multilateralism, because I kind of welcomed President Yoon's speech to the United Nations last September, because for the first time as a South Korean president, the whole speech was devoted to non-Korean issues, global issues. I never seen such president's speech in the past. So if that is, in a way, trying to showing South Korea's willingness to address global challenges, I think it's timely and it's in the right direction. But a greater global role necessarily requires a greater responsibility as well. So if you look back on Korea's domestic politics, it is true that a conservative government such as Yoon's has embraced globalism more actively than a liberal one. However, due to political divisiveness in South Korea, any decisions for more commitment and contribution to the world would become easily controversial. So the UN team will have to be faced with a big challenge of building domestic consensus. And as for Europe and Southeast Asia, I don't have much to say about it because I believe, Yoon's policy vis-a-vis Europe or Southeast Asia will not be too different from the previous governments, in the sense that relations with them mostly focus on economic cooperation, so you cannot have too many options for that.
Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable answer. I guess when I think of the GPS part as it relates to Europe, I think primarily that the economic dimension, as you mentioned, and then the quadrilateral cooperation with Australia, New Zealand, and Japan to go to the Madrid summit in the AP4, the Asia Pacific 4 configuration. That seemed to be, I think, something that was relatively positive. Next year we have the 60th anniversary of EU-South Korea relations. I think that might be a springboard for some enhanced initiatives. So I think that there's some possibilities there. Jeongmin, how do you evaluate GPS in the first year?
Two things. First of all, I may have to respectfully disagree with Ambassador Oh's assessment of the UN speech that the president made. Maybe I have too much of a high bar. Maybe I expected a little too much. The general framing of South Korea becoming more globalist and moving away from disproportionate focus on North Korea, I think that was great. But maybe this is not about the speech, but after the speech, Yoon met with the UNSG, and he talked about anti-communism. His speech was all about South Korea's global role in the 21st century. And then when he was off the speech, he pivoted back to I think it sort of seeped into his discussion, thanking the United Nations for protecting South Korea against communist powers in the past, how North Korea is an evil, sort of like sounding like axis of evil sort of discussion when it comes to framing North Korea. I think United Nations was not the best platform to bring up that topic again. So I think it would be great if the president could restrain a little bit away from just pivoting back to North Korea issues or the way he sees things especially when he's at a multilateral and global scene where South Korea wants to be shown as global pivotal state, taking care of just multiple issues, not just on North Korea. So I think that was limitation, I think. Secondly, when it comes to Europe, Southeast Asia, these non-US counterparts and partners, I think the global pivotal state laid out great principles. But like Ambassador Oh said, it's better said than done. So I think when I was talking to European diplomatic community in South Korea, it seemed like there were a lot of disappointment on how non-conventional security issues such as human rights, labor rights, and gender issues, climate, a lot of these things that Europe can actually take a very great role as a partnering region to South Korea, they did not get that much spotlight compared to how much South Korea and US has been talking about that. And even between South Korea and the US, things like gender issues, they were underrepresented. Even though the US officials, whenever they were visiting South Korea, they were nudging the Yoon administration to, we are talking to the women employees of Bank of Korea. But Yoon administration, it seemed like they didn't get the hint. So that I think was a little bit of a limitation that I look forward in 2023 for Yoon administration's global pivotal state to take a little bit more heat of. So yeah, these two limitations that I can think of.
So would you call that a gentleman C? I'm not really
Well, I'm still a student. Technically, I won't be grading. I'm usually the one that gets graded very soon.
Fair enough. I won't put you on the spot there.
Yes, thank you.
I think yeah, I've noticed something, and maybe Ambassador Oh can jump in here, and maybe this helps bridge a little bit the gap between you, Ambassador, and Jeongmin to a degree. I feel like one of the things that I've maybe looking back we should have expected, given his inauguration speech, is that Yoon seems to have taken the global pivotal state concept and in part taken it in the direction of talking about freedom. This has come up quite a bit. And I think the global dimension there seems to be based partially around the sort of universality of the value of freedom, which I think, can be construed as one of the bridges by which he would have, brought back North Korea into the discussion by saying, the international community, helps South Korea remain free, and that, this is a special relationship that South Korea has with the international community. And so this is one of the things that perhaps he feels comfortable talking about in these international fora. Maybe I'm being too generous. It might simply be that, he's just less interested in talking about climate change or other types of non-traditional security issues where there's a larger multilateral focus. But yeah, I think that might be one way of looking at it. In any event, Ambassador O, I guess first of all, any response, to what Jeongmin said, and then secondly, how within this again global pivotal state, context, how would you assess the Yoon administration's support for Ukraine? That's sort of the one major hotspot that we haven't really hit on yet. So if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that in the last little bit that we have before we have to sign off.
Yeah, when we are talking about President Yoon's activities in the United Nations, I was mostly focusing on his speech, and Jeongmin was talking about other activities as well. And as you pointed out, also Mason, the President Yoon seems to be using the term freedom quite a lot, which sometimes in a different context, different from our usual terminology in the United Nations. So I think in lieu of human rights, sometimes he uses the word freedom. Of course, freedom is part of human rights, but the concept of human rights has been discussed in the United Nations for 77 years. So there are a lot about it in the United Nations. So that could be just a little conservative way of seeing things, or that could represent his philosophy, like Amartya Sen's, development as freedom. Some people have wider interpretation of freedom in everything international. So I don't know which is which, but I can have guesses. And Ukraine, when it comes to providing assistance to Ukraine, I understand that the Yoon government is carrying on with the previous position that would not provide lethal weapons to a country that is in conflict, which I think is appropriate. But other than that, what South Korea has to do in dealing with fallout from the war is mostly in the economic area. Eventually, however, I think we will have to think about the aftermath of the war. That would probably include a global debate on reforming the international peacekeeping mechanism. The war in Ukraine has revealed the weakest point of the United Nations, as the world body is unable to take any collective action against Russia and therefore cannot fulfill its original function of maintaining peace.
Totally a fair point. Jeongmin, I'm just going to give you the last word. 30 seconds to close this down, either on anything that you want to say about the first 7 months of Yoon's foreign security policy, or maybe something that you think is interesting looking forward to 2023.
Well, like Ambassador O eloquently explained, the global pivotal state, the vision of it, it has a very globalist point of view, and in principle, they are, I think, great if we can implement them. But because you gave me 30 seconds, my final word is, in order for the principle and the policy not to be seen as hypocritical, I think the Yoon administration should serve their own words at home as well. Things like referring to the trucker strike as similar to North Korean nuclear threat, I don't think that gives a very good optic to what the foreign policy team is actually trying to show the world what South Korea is capable of. So that's my final word.
Absolutely. Something that we could have talked about for the next hour, which is the way the domestic politics feed into these international political issues and the reverse. Personally, I happen to like Korea and would like to stay here. So I'm a little bit afraid that if we talk about domestic politics, I might get myself into big trouble. And I might get hounded out of the country. So it's probably best that we leave it there. But Jeongmin, however, was more courageous than I was. So I give her credit for that. Anyway, I just want to thank both of you for joining me today for this Asia Society Korea discussion on the Yoon administration's foreign and security policy over the first 7 months, and looking forward to next year. I think you've covered almost all of the important questions, the important regions, the bilateral and multilateral partners. And so, I hope that all of the viewers at home or wherever they are that are watching this realize that they've been treated to two fabulous experts who've done, I think, a fabulous job of laying out all the important issues in a concise manner. So thanks to each of you for joining me, and thanks to everyone at home who has watched this. I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and hopefully 2023 will be an improvement over 2022. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Happy
you,
holidays.
Yeah, happy holiday.